The table shows values for a function g at selected values of x. Which of the following claim and explanation statements best fits these data? So the answer choices either claim that this function is linear or quadratic. So let's look at the table of values to see which one. So let's look at the changes from g of x between each value. So for the x values, we see that they're all increasing by 1 each increment. So now let's calculate the differences in the g of x values. So from 53 to 78, so 78 minus 53, that's equal to 25. Then from 78 to 97, so 97 minus 78, that's equal to 19. Then the change from 97 to 110, that's 110 minus 97, and that's equal to 13. And then from 110 to 117, that's 117 minus 110, and that's equal to just 7. So what we see is that although x is changing by the same amount every time, the change in g is not constant, meaning the change from one g of x value to the next is not the same every time. This means this cannot be linear. So we can rule out any of the answer choices that say this is linear. Because in a linear function, the rise over the run, the slope is the same. For every one change in x, the change in y is the same. So it's some x value that's the change. And that's the same across the whole line. So this function g of x cannot be linear. Now, to determine whether it is quadratic, we need to look at the average change in the rates of change. So these are the rates of change. We see that from 0 to 1, the total change in g of x is 25 for every one increment, and that changes. So let's find the changes in those rates of change. So in going from 25 to 19, that's a decrease of 6 units, so -6 is the change. From 19 to 13, the change is -6 as well. And from 13 to 7, the change is also -6. So we see that the change in the average rate of change across equivalent changes in input values is the same. This means we have a quadratic function. So if we look at the answer choices, C and D both say that G is modeled by a quadratic function. But C says that this is because the rate of change over consecutive equal length input values is constant. This is not true. We see that the change in g of x is not constant. This would only be the case if it was linear. While D says because the change in the average rates of change over consecutive equal length input values is constant. That's true. We had to find the change in the average rates of change, and we found those to be constant. They were all -6. So D is the correct answer.